Tonight, the Prime Minister will hold a much-anticipated bilateral meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Before he does, though, Anthony Albanese has defended the extent of his overseas travel. Ahead of tomorrow's cash rate decision, let's go live to our political editor, Andrew Clennell, travelling with the Prime Minister. And while this visit is of enormous historical significance and great political significance as well, Andrew, you put the question to the Prime Minister that most punters will be concerned about on Melbourne Cup Day, and that's the looming and likely rate rise.
Well, that's right, Kieran, and that's particularly in the context after this Chinese trip, the PM heads to the Cook Islands for the Pacific Islands Forum. Then he intends to go to APEC in San Francisco. Given he's meeting President Xi here tonight and he's met President Biden last week in the US, does he really need to go to APEC as well? It'll be something like 19 trips in 19 months for the PM. Look, we know Australia's been in the diplomatic deep freeze with China. It's coming out. Well, Anthony Albanese was out in the cold today. I'm standing in front of the Temple of Heaven, which he was very cold indeed before his press conference, as we all were. It was about 3 degrees. This is a historic site. It's 700 years old. It's where they used to pray, the emperors, for a good harvest. And certainly there's prayers from the Prime Minister those beef and lobster sanctions will be lifted, and the expectation is in the Australian government after this meeting with President Xi, they will be. He really wants to play up the significance of the Gough Whitlam visit here in 1973, Kieran. 50 years later to the month, and he's visiting the same site, the Temple of Heaven, as Gough Whitlam did. Very symbolic, got pretty cold in the process. But yes, I thought it was important to put this question to him. We've seen in the news poll today, the Liberal primary vote's up, Labor's still in an election-winning lead. But there's little doubt that back home, and you don't see it in the bubble here, I guess, as the travelling press, the public are sort of saying, you're overseas quite a bit. The US and China trips are quite important, but what about us? So this is what the PM had to say. He turned it into an economic narrative around this trip. Some commentators are saying this is your most important trip, overseas trip yet. Do you agree with that assessment? And what's your message to homeowners in Australia who are seeing you undertake all this overseas travel and might be copping a rate rise tomorrow?
I'm not a commentator, so I'll leave that to others. What I say is that quite clearly, yesterday I was with 250 Australian businesses. That's about Australian jobs. That has an impact on our economy. That has an impact on inflation. It has an impact on how successful we are. We're a trading nation. This is very much in Australia's national interest for us to be engaged, just as it was in Australia's national interest for me to be engaged in the United States.
So it's just 4 or 5 hours till the most significant moment on this trip, and that's the meeting with President Xi. And a couple of senior members of the press gallery here put a pretty tricky question to Anthony Albanese. We know we're getting AUKUS nuclear submarines. We know we've got cybersecurity concerns around China, human rights concerns. We're fighting for, the government's fighting at least for the release of another detained Australian. Do you trust President Xi? Well, Anthony Albanese said, well, look, I've asked him for things and he has delivered on them, but he didn't want to expressly talk about that trust. He was able to dodge this particular hand grenade.
Just further to Mark's question, trust. Do you trust him?
Well, we have different political systems, but the engagement that I've had with China, with President Xi, have been positive. They have been constructive. He has never said anything to me that has not been done. And that's a positive way that you have to start off dealing with people. But we recognise as well that we come with different political systems, very different values arising from that, and different histories. But we deal with each other on face value, and we deal with each other representing, my job is to represent Australia's national interests. He is the leader of a different nation with different interests.
Now, Andrew, you covered the first meeting between the Prime Minister and President Xi. Often with these, it's the opening remarks where we might get a sense of where the discussion will go, and then we wait till tomorrow, don't we, to get the full wrap-up from the PM?
Yeah, that's the weird thing about this one, Kieran. With the Bali visit, even though it was late in the evening, that Anthony Albanese emerged, particularly Australian time. He gave a press conference straight away, so he had the full story. Now this isn't even, we won't even be getting this live telecast. We'll be getting the opening remarks sent to us unless you're one of 3 or 4 reporters in the pool. And so that's all we'll get this evening, and then he holds a press conference tomorrow morning where he will expand on what was said. What I can say from those opening remarks from that meeting I remember well is that Anthony Albanese didn't just keep it to niceties. He did speak about the differences in the views of the two governments and about some of the measures that he wanted to see undertaken. So I do expect him to mention the South China Sea, human rights, even Yang Hengjun perhaps, but also to have some language praising perhaps the Chinese government's trade with Australia, etc., being amenable to opening things up. And all the signs I get here, Kieran, is that China, who've been such a powerhouse economy, they've had a tougher time of late, are into opening things up. We've been told this is about a stabilisation of the relationship. It won't go back to 2016 when Malcolm Turnbull was here, but I think there were some positive signs in Premier Li Qian's speech to the Import Expo in Shanghai in terms of him saying they're open to more trade, China. So, look, we are sort of waiting with bated breath for what comes out of this meeting, but from the Prime Minister's point of view, it's better to engage than not. And this is a bit of a precursor, let's face it, to an expected meeting between President Biden and President Xi in about a week's time in San Francisco at APEC.